We can never. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied.
They attacked the victim, and then the criminal who attacked the victim accuses the victim of attacking him. This is American justice.
That's right.
This is American democracy. And those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy.
You have a choice. Violence to defend yourself, you know what I'm saying? Turn the other cheek, or wait for the news cameras to come and talk about it.
Now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. It is time to beat up prosecutors you don't like at the voting booth. It is time to hold mayoral offices accountable, chiefs and deputy chiefs. I woke up wanting to see the world burn down yesterday. I'm tired of seeing black men die. He casually put his knee on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as he died like a zebra in the clutch of a lion's jaw. And we watch it like murder porn over and over again. So that's why children are burned to the ground. They don't know what else to do. And it is the responsibility of us to make this better. Right now, we don't want to see one officer charged. We want to see 4 officers prosecuted and sentenced. We don't want to see targets burned. We want to see the system that sets up for systemic racism burnt to the ground. And as I sit here in Georgia, home Stevens, Georgia, former vice president of the Confederacy, white man said that fundamental law stated that whites were naturally the superior race, and the Confederacy was built on a cornerstone. It's called a cornerstone speech. Look it up. The cornerstone speech that blacks would always be subordinate. That officer believed that speech because he killed that man like an animal. When a man yells for his mother and the rest of pain and she's dead, he is essentially yelling, please God, don't let it happen.
Good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gordon Weiborg, and I'll be your host this evening for day 3 of the National Plus Coalition's Revival for Justice event. We're here this week to discuss issues and matters around police brutality and the perception of how people are treated by the police in America. We've got a couple of special guests here this evening that will also be telling us their stories, things that have happened to them and where they've been. I want to start out a little bit by setting a couple of definitions out, because when you talk about a legal environment, which is what we're doing, then we need to understand some legal terms. The first one really that we want to make sure we understand is qualified immunity. Now, qualified immunity will put the hair up on a lot of people's back neck because there are issues with it. There are problems with that. We'll deal with that as we go along, but please understand a couple of things about qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a legal concept in the civil courts. It is not a criminal court concept. It's a civil court concept. In other words, qualified immunity gives certain protection. Take this as an example. Let's say that in your job, you make an honest mistake doing something and somebody loses something for it. Is it fair, or would it be fair for you to lose your house, your car, your family, and everything because you made a mistake? On the other hand, if you have done something out of gross negligence or intent for somebody, in other words, let's say you have done something you knew was wrong and it harmed somebody you wanted to see harmed. Now, if that happened, is it fair that you pay nothing, lose nothing for it, and go on in your job and your career? So there's three levels of law that we deal with around qualified immunity. There's criminal law, which charges, of course, with criminal charges. There's civil law, where people get sued for things and can lose certain property or rights. And then there's administrative law. The administrative law is the law that goes around disciplinary actions and actions that a police department would take against an employee who has done something wrong. That's administrative law. Oftentimes in the courts, they deal with the organizations at that point. In fact, I'll talk about one of those here in just a minute. So qualified immunity gives certain limited immunity to public officials. It's not only cops, but all public officials for their personal property in job-related mistakes or errors or problems that they're a part of. That's qualified immunity. Then we talk about a number of use of force and deadly force. You know, a lot of what we're talking about this week are officer-involved shootings, brutality, use of force, excessive force that the police have allegedly used against somebody. And many times we'll see that on a video. And of course, we just saw a court trial in Minneapolis, my hometown of Minneapolis, where I was born and raised. We saw a Minneapolis police officer convicted of homicide charges in the death of George Floyd. That is a watershed for what's coming, ladies and gentlemen. We need to understand that the world is changing. And while the world is changing, police are also changing. It would behoove the police community to come up and gain some control of that so that it's a collaborative effort with everybody. As we talked about use of force, I was a use of force instructor for a number of years. I'm a retired chief of police. I spent 43 years in government service. 35 of those years, I was a police officer. I ended up as a chief of police in a couple of places in Washington State and Hawaii for the U.S. Army in Hawaii, where I spent the last 4 years as a chief before I became disabled. I'm actually talking to you. I'm laying in my back in the International Space Station. No, actually, this is a capsule that I'm in my home office because I'm disabled. In uses of force, please understand that one of the questions we've had is, where can we find the policies and the laws on use of force? Please understand that there are, again, 3 levels of law that deal with use of force. The first one is the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, which interprets the U.S. Constitution. Use of force and deadly force is interpreted under the 4th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, because the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, has determined that a use of force is a seizure of somebody. If I arrest somebody or I shoot somebody or I use force on somebody, that's a seizure of somebody. Under the 4th Amendment, we have constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure, which is where use of force comes in. So that's the top level of it, where the Supreme Court interprets the 4th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Below that, then you have 50 states, each of which have different state statutes that will deal with use of force and deadly force. And then below that, you have 20,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. Think about that. 20,000 police departments, sheriff's departments, state, federal, local law enforcement agencies. In the federal government alone, there are nearly 100 law enforcement agencies. There are 700,000 law enforcement officers in the United States, about that. So you've got 50 states, each of which have different state statutes. You've got the federal government, and then below that, you've got 20,000 police agencies, each of which has their own SOP, standard operating procedures, and a policy book. My last command when I was the chief of police in Hawaii, my policy book was probably 4 inches thick if you printed it out. Those policies are public data because they belong to the public. They're government documents. You should have no problem getting your policies for local use of force and deadly force from your law enforcement agencies. It may take a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, but you could put that in and get those documents, hopefully electronically, because it's a whole lot easier. But please understand that each of those departments out there has their own policy book. The sheriff's department, a police department here, and another police department over here, and they may all be very different. Hopefully, we're starting to standardize more. When I started in law enforcement in 1973, there were almost 40,000 law enforcement agencies, and each of them had the 4 inches of policy book. A lot of those have now consolidated, and we've got what's called CALEA, which is a coalition for the accreditation of law enforcement agencies, which puts out a standard under POST. POST has come in also for most of our states, which is Peace Officer Standards and Training, to standardize what it is the officers go through for training, both initial training and maintenance over their career. That's getting a whole lot better, but we still have a lot of work to do. We're still not there. One thing that you'll see me do tonight, and then we'll carry it on through our speakers, we have some big issues to deal with in law enforcement. We have to be honest about that. We have to say there are problems, because there are. If we sit down like this and talk about it and discuss it and deal with it with facts, and that's why I started out with qualified immunity tonight, we have to understand the facts of what it is we're talking about, because they become emotional issues really fast. And if we can stay on the intellectual side before we go to the emotional, in most of it, we'll be better off. I want to move real quick for the last couple of minutes of my time here and give a little bit about my past and why I'm here and what's happened there to my life. I started out in 1973, as I say, in law enforcement. I was a 19-year-old kid. I didn't really know what was going on, and I got into police work and thought, oh, this is pretty cool. It got into my blood. I wanted to help people. I know that sounds trite, but it's true. Initially, I was trained by several police officers who turned out to be corrupt. I'll just put it that way. Initially, I thought they were doing the right thing and the way that things happened, the way that we treated people, I started getting less and less comfortable with as we went along. Within a few months of starting training with them, I ended up blowing the whistle on them and going to the state attorney general's office. They started an investigation. They already had one going on the cops and used me as an informant. That worked out okay until we ended up arresting everybody and going to court. They arrested me, took me into jail, booked me through jail just like everybody else so that all the cops would see that I was just like them. Unfortunately, they forgot to tell the court and the judge and everybody else prosecuting when we got to court that I was the informant. And I ended up getting convicted just like everybody else, but now I was a wrongfully convicted person. And I ended up having to go back to the state and the court to get that cleared up with a state that didn't want to come out and admit what they had done. Instead of protecting the person that they should have protected, they threw everybody under the bus. I got a reputation, of course, at that point of being someone who was anti-police. Obviously, I wasn't. I was a cop who wanted to do things the right way. I wanted to respect people. I wanted to arrest people without beating them up. I wanted to do things that I thought was the right way to do them, and I began to do that. Because I turned in some cops, and in my rookie year, I, by pure luck, came across the president of the local Fraternal Order of Police, the local union for the cops for the biggest city in the area. And I arrested him on a night they had a party, and he drove through my city that I was patrolling, doing bumper cars on the highway. I ended up stopping him and arresting him. And when we got down to booking, and I knew he was a cop, I knew he was the president of that. He had big stickers on his car. Towed the car, took him to jail. And as he sat across the desk from me in booking, he looked at me and he said, "You know I'm a cop, right?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Don't you believe in professional courtesy, young man?" he said. And I looked at him and I said, "Yes, sir. Professional courtesy is you don't drive drunk in my city and I don't arrest you, sir." He went to court and went down for drunk driving. I now became marked. Now I was the cop who was after the cops. Now I was the cop who was ostracized. I spent almost 15 years going to calls alone. I stopped traffic alone. I arrested people alone because I got very little help, very little backup. I was harassed. I had tires on my take-home police car slashed. I had condoms filled and hung off my locker at work. I had my locker painted at work. I had bogus sexual harassment claims. And for basically 15 years, I went through hell, including one night, and this is the last thing that I'll go through and then I'm going to turn it over. I have been, in my career, I've been shot at 4 times. 2 of those 4 times, I've been hit. The time that I was shot in 1978, I had just gotten off duty as an undercover narcotics in a bar. got home about 3 o'clock in the morning, went to bed. Within a few seconds, and I'm asleep, there was a huge crash, and the building that I was in shook. I was in an apartment building. I called in right away to have patrols come over and stood up. When I stood up, the second round of a 20-gauge shotgun came through the window at me and grazed my head. Fortunately, now after that many years, there are no side effects from the head injury. But I do have 3 little tracks in my head, if you were to look close enough to see where the rounds went from the BBs. I found later in the investigation that I was marked enough as a police officer that other police officers wanted me dead. I found that they already had killed one of the officers involved in the investigation years earlier in a very strange drowning accident, that he had died, and that I was the second one that they were going to kill. Obviously, I survived that one, and eventually, as I went on to become a commander and a chief, I went on a pilgrimage, if you will, and I'm still on a pilgrimage because I believe in and I support good police officers. And I despise and do everything that I can to purge law enforcement of bad police officers. Because if we can get rid of those guys from law enforcement, that helps everybody on both sides of the thin blue line. With that, I'm going to go on to our first guest. Anthony Gay was arrested in 1994 for getting into a fight. Then a fight with another inmate, which snowballed into torture for 22 years of solitary confinement. 22 years of solitary. Yet Anthony didn't allow the experience to make him bitter. Anthony is using his experience to throw the lost, forgotten, and hopeless a rope of hope. Anthony currently has a bill pending in his name titled Anthony Gay Isolated Confinement Restriction Act in the Senate of his home state of Illinois to restrict solitary confinement to 10 days within 6 months. Anthony was released from solitary confinement in August of 2018. Since his release, he's had many interviews in print and broadcast media. The highlights include his story on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, January 2nd, 2019, if you want to look it up, and a recent interview with national correspondent Lindsay Davis of ABC. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Anthony Gay.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Anthony Gay. I want to give a little background information first, and then I'll talk about brutality in prison. In 1994, I had a street fight, and I was arrested for aggravated battery and robbery. I was told that aggravated battery was a class 1 and carried 4 to 15 years, and robbery was a class 2 and a class 3 and carried 3 to 7. So I was thinking I don't want to face 4 to 15 years for a street fight. So I plead guilty to the robbery and get probation 4 days later, I'm driving without a license. They revoked my probation and re-sentenced me to 7 years. And this when I find out that aggravated battery is not a class 1, that robbery is not a class 3, that aggravated battery is a class 3, and robbery is a class 2. So basically, they tricked me to plead guilty to the higher offense. And so I end up going to prison with a 7-year sentence. I had been in solitary confinement a couple of times, but not too long. So I had a fight with a guy in a prison called Shawnee, and I ended up being transferred to another prison called Menard Correctional Center. Well, I was there for like 2 weeks, and I'm going to the shower, and he comes running out the shower. I don't even know he was there. So he comes running out the shower, and he swings on me, and I duck. And I grew up wrestling, so I hit him with a double leg takedown, and we started fighting. And so the police shoot a gun. The correctional officers shoot a gun off. They run in, beat us up, mace us, and take us to solitary confinement. Now, at the time, I had no idea that I was about to spend 22 long, torturous years in solitary confinement. So, like when I get in solitary confinement, I'm in a cell smaller than the size of a parking space, 24 hours a day behind a solid steel door. And time descends like the lid of a coffin. So in order to cope, I'm doing things like blocking my chuck hole, to feel alive. So people, you could talk to people and associate with people. I'm doing other things like blocking my chuck hole, scratching myself, taking pills to get out the cell. So the officers, they hate that. They don't want to do no extra work. No one never wanted to see it as a human rights problem or a mental health problem. They wanted to see it as you're being chaotic. You don't want to conform to the rules. You want to be disobedient. So they would do things like attack me, beat me up. Not only me, they'll do it to other inmates too, right? So the environment really ate at me. So even though like they used to beat me up, instead of me like just going in a corner and folding up, in a sense, it reinforced me hurting my own self, right? Because when you're in that type of environment, which is psychologically darkening the inside of a cow, you will lose it psychologically. So in order to offset the psychological pain, I had to learn to develop to engage in physical pain and to accept physical pain from the people that were supposed to be watching me, whether or not, right? So there's some specific incidents I remember like yesterday, right? Like for example, I started out like scratching on myself, but over the years it got worse and worse to where it would become like super horrific. So I remember on one occasion that I was in Pontiac Correctional Center, and the cell was psychologically eating me inside out. So I wanted to get out. So I had cut my arm, I embedded a zipper in it, and I sutured it with a piece of sheet. So an officer walked by and I showed it to him, and he looked at me and said, "Cool," kept walking. So approximately 12 hours later, I cut my inner thigh and blood ran out on the gallery. Subsequently, a lieutenant and 6 officers came to my cell. So they tell me to cuff up. I cuff up. They got me cuffed behind my back, and they bring me out the cell. Now, keep in mind, I went to prison with 7 years. Now, when I was in there, like deteriorating, and one of the other things I used to do to try to get out the cell was I would throw fluids out the side of the door, out the crack of the door. Maybe it's like an inch crack, right? And it'll splatter out there, and it might hit a drip, might hit their pants leg, whatever, whatnot. So once again, instead of seeing it as a mental health problem, he's trying to get out the cell, and we need to give him some mental health treatment. They would prosecute me for this, and they literally gave me approximately 100 years for this, right? Prison time. They took me to court, prosecuted me, and gave me additional 100 years prison time. So back to the incident at hand. Now they bringing me out the cell, and they're taking me to this bullpen area. Now I'm cuffed behind my back, and there's a nurse out there. So they put me flat on my face, and an officer, he started trying to yank the piece of sheet out my arm, and he realizes that he can't get it out. So he takes the key off his belt and he says, this is the closest you will ever get to the key. Meaning, because he knew I had got those 100 years additional time. So he says, this is the closest you will ever get to the key. So he cuts the zipper out my arm. He cuts the piece of sheet out my arm, and he cuts flesh out my arm. So these are the type of things that I had to endure in solitary confinement. I had to witness other people enduring solitary confinement, and there was no accountability for it. Like if you complain about it, you file a grievance, they'll basically find a means to circumvent your grievance. Like they'll say it's untimely. Like they'll sit on it to make it appear like it's untimely. Or when you file a grievance, officers will throw your grievance away. Or they'll say that it couldn't be verified, whether or not, right? So they never do an adequate investigation and hold the correctional officers accountable for that kind of brutality. And then another one of the things they would do, and it would be done to like break your spirit. Let's say, for example, I have a medical issue. I need to see the nurse, and the staff, they don't want to do, to them that's extra work. No matter what it is, if you're saying I need a roll of toilet paper, I need the plunger, whatever, not whatever it is you need. A lot of them, they have an attitude where like that's a privilege for you to get that, and you don't need that, so it's a big deal for them. So let's say there's an incident where I need to see the nurse, right? I might be having pain in my arm, whatever, not, and they don't want to get the nurse. So the inmate, he might cover his door up. So then the lieutenant will come to the cell and they'll say, take that down. And you might be like, well, I need to see the nurse. And he said, well, take that down and we'll let you see the nurse. So he'll take it down, but they won't let him see the nurse. So it goes through it again. He puts it back up. Now this time he already knows the lieutenant just want him to take it down, and he doesn't care about what his issue might be, no matter how serious, whether or not it might be, right? So then the inmate actually put it back up. And then, now these are actual incidents. I'm just not saying people names, right? So he'll put it back up, and then they'll come and they'll tell him to take it down, and he'll be like, I'm not taking it down. So they'll call extraction team. Well, extraction team is made up of 6 people dressed in orange jumpsuits, umpire vests, Darth Vader helmets. They'll have a baton, they'll have a cameraman, and then they'll have a baton, a oak stick. So these people will come, they'll give you a direct order to cuff up. They'll give you another direct order. They'll give you a third direct order. You don't cuff up, they spray a big can of mace in your cell. They'll let it simmer for like 3 or 4 minutes to try to cause you trouble breathing. Then they'll open the cell up and they'll come in and they'll beat your brains in, right? And then after they beat your brains in, they'll take you to this room they call like a shakedown room. They'll take you in there. They'll strip you naked. Once they strip you naked, they'll tell the nurse to come in and look at you to make sure that you don't need no medical treatment, or wash your eyes out. But washing your eyes out just consists of her spraying a bottle, just 1 squirt in each eye, and now she's considered washing your eyes out. This is the type of treatment they'll take you to. Then what they'll do is they'll march you back to the cell, but they'll march you to the cell naked, and they'll have you bent over so everyone can see your bottom part, to basically embarrass you and humiliate you and deteriorate you for like standing up for whatever it is, irrespective if it was because you needed to see the nurse or you didn't get a food tray and you wanted your food. Everything in there is about dominance, control, and you submitting and being subject to submission. So it's a psychological dark environment. There's not, I mean, I can't really tell you a lot of stories about the police brutality with myself per se, but I actually witnessed a lot of police brutality per se. Like for another example, there's a senator. Well, he's not a senator, he's a congressman, and he's a United States congressman, and he has a nephew that's someone I was close to. I remember I was next door to him, and they had him stripped out, because here's another one of their tactics, to try to get you to submit, as far as just basically breaking your spirit, like doing everything they tell you, irrespective if it's right or wrong. So I remember I'm next to this congressman nephew. I'm next door to him, and they're telling him to cuff up, to come out the cell, but he's naked. He don't have no clothes on. They got him stripped out. They don't want to give him none, so he's not doing it. He's telling him he needs some clothes. So since he wouldn't cuff up, so they could bring him out naked to humiliate him, they opened his chuck hole. Now, if you've been in prison for a while, you pretty much know what comes next, right? You know their move before they make it, as far as like the brutality, what or whatnot, right? So he knew what came next, but he had nothing to like block it. So he puts his bottom part up against the door, the chuck hole, because the chuck hole's like maybe 4 inches, 4 or 5 inches high, and maybe 5 or 6 inches in width, something 7 or 8, something like that in width, right? So he knows what comes next. She's finna spray him. So he puts his bottom part up to the chuck hole, because when mace come in your cell, it's going to overwhelm you to cause you trouble breathing. But if you could keep it out as much as possible, it won't cause you. It still will cause you trouble breathing, but it won't be so bad, because it's the fumes that actually cause you trouble breathing. So he knew he had to block it some type of way. So he puts his bottom up to it, and they mace him in his bottom. So for someone like me, going through these type of incidents, witnessing other people go through these type of incidents, it scarred me, right? To where it still sits with me today, and it still bothers me. So that's why I pretty much dedicated my life to fighting for people like that, until the day I die, or until things like solitary confinement is dismantled. Because I don't know if anyone ever heard of the Stanford prison experiment, but there's a guy named Craig Haney, which is a prominent psychologist right now, that's actually has interviewed me, because I have a lawsuit for being tortured in solitary confinement. Well, in any event, in the Stanford prison experiment, they had 6 guards, 6 college kids play guards. Then they had 6 college kids play inmate. And the guys that played guards, they basically had control over the 6 people who were inmates. And within 6 days, we're talking 6 days, they had to stop the experiment, because the guys that became guard became real cruel and were mistreating the guys that were playing the inmate. So if that happens in 6 days, just imagine everything I went through for 22 years. I went through things like to where officers would get mad. They would get mad because I cut myself, not because of something I did to them, but it's because it's the only way I can get out the cell. And it became a coping mechanism to where ironically, I mean, it sounds ironic, but I think if I wouldn't have did what I did, like cut myself, even though it was horrific, to get out the cell so I could receive social stimulation and human contact, I think it would have psychologically broke me to where I probably would have actually committed suicide. So this became a coping mechanism, because not only do I get to communicate with nurses, mental health, other humans, I also get out the cell and alleviate some of the psychological pain. So the officers used to hate this. They'll be like, he's being manipulative. Why are you getting him out the cell? Just leave him in the cell. But if anyone knows anything about nurses, nurses has an oath to be caring. They have an oath to be compassionate. So the nurses are looking at like, I can't leave him in the cell. We got to get him out the cell. So now the officers realize the nurses are not going to go along with them with the mistreatment. They have to get me out the cell. But here's one of the things they would try to do, in which they did on multiple occasions. Like when I was in a supermax at one point, because of mental health problems, the way the prison environment is designed, at least in Illinois, right? So I was in a supermax. So now I'm in a supermax. They have a blind spot between. Now, where I was housed at, I was housed in a place called TAM Supermax, and they have pods. They got A pod, B pod, C pod, D, E, and F. and each pod have 6 wings. So because I engaged in self-harm on a regular basis because it was a coping mechanism and the only way I could survive, they didn't want me around nobody, period, to see it. So they isolated me on a wing all by myself, made a strap down bed on the wing just for me, even wrote my name on it. This is how they wrote my name on it. So what they would do is to try to break my spirit and get me to stop engaging in self-harm, knowing the nurse was going to help me. They would bring me out the cell, and when you come off the wing, you go around like a little corner. And between the wing and the nurse's station is a blind spot, and there's a closet right there. So they'll bring me off the wing and take me in the nurse's station, and they'll play it cool, right? Like everything's cool. I'll be talking to the nurse, she'll patch me up. Then when we bring me out the nurse's station, they'll take me right in that blind spot and give it to me, right? Thinking that it's gonna break my spirit and stop me from doing what I was doing in order to survive. So those are the type of things that I had to endure for 22 years because of the brutality they inflicted on me. Another means that they use brutality, it wasn't always physical. Another one they used was there was an unappetizing diet called meal loaf. It looked like feces and tastes like dog food. So in another effort to try to break my spirit, they would say, well, you cut yourself and you got blood on the floor, so that's a health hazard. So you're going on meal loaf. So they would put me on meal loaf for 6 days. Now, meal loaf looked like feces and it tastes like dog food, and it depleted me of my energy. It was worse than the physical brutality because I don't know what they put in it or what's not in it, but I do know that it just feel like you're eating air feces is the best way I could describe it, right? And it made me feel it made me feel weak, and it almost broke my spirit. I won't lie, right? It had me like ready to cry because you have to remember I was on the wing by myself. So even if I had allies, people that wanted to help me, another inmate, he couldn't slide me food on a line because I don't know if you guys know anything about that, but in prison they got what you call fishing lines. So guys could slide things to you. They'll make a line, they'll rip a sheet up, put a milk carton, smash it up on the end of it, or a book, and they'll slide it from one cell to the next. So had guys been on the wing with me, they probably could have saved me a breakfast sandwich, some scrambled eggs, or whatever not, and put it in the envelope and smashed it and sent it to me. But since I was on a wing all by myself, guys couldn't do that for me. They couldn't throw me a rope of hope, as I like to say, or offer a hope or a helping hand. I had to sit there and tolerate this repeatedly over and over and over for years, besides the abuse and the beatings and the cell extractions. They came to realize that that wasn't going to work. So they kind of backed off on that and just started using like the meal loaf because they know it inflicted more harm. Because you have to, which all this, what I'm saying is ironic, right? Because when you're in that type of environment, you need touch to feel alive. So even though the police are brutalizing me and beating me, it's making me feel alive. So they came to realize that. So that's when they reverted to the technique of, well, we don't even have to touch him to brutalize him. We could put him on meal loaf. We can strip him out naked, put him in a freezing cell and let him freeze, or we can strap him down naked in 6-point restraints, which I would be restrained my ankles, both arms above my head, across my chest, 3 or 4 days, and not feed me. So these are the type of things that went on with me for 22 years. There was no break. There wasn't no, I did a year in solitary and got out, or I did 3 days in solitary and went back, or a week and went back. I'm talking 22 consecutive years from 1996 to 2018. I was trapped in a cell, small in a parking space, and it was psychologically darker than the inside of a cab. It was so bad, right? That there was a nurse, and this is why I love nurses and I'm gonna love nurses to the day I die. There was a nurse She was scared that I was going to end up killing myself, or the police was going to end up killing me. So she was so concerned that she said that she wanted me to write her daughter, because her daughter had mental health problems too, right? So she was thinking she could solve two problems at one time. So she went to the extreme, allowing me to write her daughter. And her daughter, we used to write back. She used to take the letters back and forth. And this lady was risking her career and her life because she was so scared that I was going to kill myself. So what eventually ended up happening is those 100 years that I got, I end up getting it back. Um, because I refused to give up, even though I was subject to police brutality. Everyone threw in the towel and thought it was over for me. Even my family, like when I got out, people in my family was like, they said it was over with for you. We thought you was never getting out. And I remember my niece, she was 9 years old at the time. She had wrote me a letter, and she said she heard I had life, and that was sad, and it made her sad. And I also remember my mom came to see me one time. I was in Dixon in the mental health unit, and I had 100 years hanging over my head. And my mom had said to me, now this was all around the same time. My niece wrote me the letter, and my mom came to see me. And my mom was like, the only thing I want from you is to come home before I die. So I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to do that? I got 100 years. I said, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to figure out a way. And I also said, I'm going to have to prove to my niece that she can't believe everything she hears. So I fought, I lost 80 times, but I had a fire in me to where I believe in God. I don't know about nobody else, right? I come to realize Philip Yancey wrote a book. It's called Where is God When It Hurts? It's a book about pain. And at one point in the book, it says, I strive to be grateful, not for the pain itself, but for the opportunity to respond, to form good out of what looks bad. So I got it in my head that even though everything I went through was bad, all the brutality, all the mistreatment, all the lack of adequate mental health treatment, I said that I would get out and I would dedicate my life to dismantling solitary confinement, right? And that I would start in Illinois. So I got out, I went to Springfield, and I went and I talked to Ford, representative. He's a representative of Illinois, because there was a bill pending already, but it wasn't going nowhere. So as soon as I went in there, he said, I know you. He said, you were on the front page of Chicago Tribune. And then I got to tell him about my story, and we came up with the idea to put my face on the bill. So we put my face on the bill, had a big press conference in Chicago. The bill got passed in the House. It's currently pending in the Senate. So I'm trying to gather support for it. Because I believe one of the greatest states for change is awareness, get people behind it. In November, I'm hoping in a video session that we can get it passed. I've also established, because of the brutality in society that I've witnessed, a Section 1983 initiative where, because people in my community have no idea about, they have idea about police brutality, but they have no idea about Section 1983 as a means to offset police brutality. All they know is the police jump on them, beat them up, illegally seize their phone, their money, their property, and they think it's nothing that they can't do. And that's not true. They actually could file with Section 1983. And even though the city won't hold the police accountable, this is a means where they can hold the police accountable. So I started a nonprofit called Section 1983 Initiative, where we inform, educate, and if people want to file a lawsuit, I got some lawyers on board that'll help them file a lawsuit. In addition, I have a lawsuit. I know everyone pretty much heard about George Floyd. Well, Ben Crump was George Floyd lawyers. Another one of George Floyd lawyers was Antonio Ramanucci from Ramanucci and Blandon. Antonio Ramanucci is one of my lawyers right now, and I'm suing Illinois Department of Corrections for torturing me and brutalizing me for 22 years in solitary confinement.
Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of what you're going to hear tonight and the other nights of this event are going to be very difficult to hear. A lot of these things may, in fact, trigger for you as cops firefighters, EMTs, nurses out there, please understand that we are here and we are presenting because we are concerned. We are concerned about things like Anthony's experiences, which are horrific. They're terrible. And I listened to that. And as a police officer, as a police chief, I'm ashamed. But by the same token, we understand that most of the people out there are good people. Most of the people out there want to make a living just like you and I do. But everybody here right now on this set that you see has been through something or multiple somethings at the hand of a system which has eaten us up and spit us out. And we're here to tell you that we're concerned and to relate our experiences so that you can evaluate that. Next, I'd like to introduce Sarah Jane, who's a former firefighter and EMT. She became the first female interior firefighter and EMT in a prison district in New York. She became an instructor in courses including active shooter, weapons of mass destruction, and critical incident management for first responders, all of which are classes that I've taken and are very familiar with. And she's a former decon coordinator for a county hazmat team. Sarah Jane is a dual diagnosis therapist and educator, bridging the gap between mental health and substance use. She's the founder and director of the Parchman Project, a prison reform organization that assists, educates, and advocates for those affected by incarceration and their families, providing guidance and mentorship as families navigate the incarceration system. Sarah Jane provides a platform for those incarcerated to tell their stories about life on the inside. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Sarah Jane.
Thank you. It is an absolute honor to be on this panel with both of you and to hear both of your stories. You know, Anthony, I'm very familiar with, you know, the isolation of solitary confinement. I was fighting with, I was in New York. They have a campaign called the HALT campaign, and that they're looking to end the solitary confinement as well. And I've heard a lot of stories, you know, similar to yours, is what happens, and it's very devastating. And you know, tonight we heard two very amazing stories of resiliency and survival from both of you, and that is absolutely awesome. I'm not really going to tell too much of a story, but I am going to, you know, back up what you both are saying with some statistics and talk a little bit more about the mental health. I have a PowerPoint that we'll be sharing. Mental health in the criminal justice world. Okay. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the general requirements to become a police officer. You can become a police officer with just a high school diploma, GED, or equivalent. Some post-secondary education or degree is highly recommended in law enforcement, criminal justice. A lot of times, people that served in the military have that background as well. And also completion of a police academy training, which often is up to about a year. And Chief, you could probably talk a little bit more of that at the end of this. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, to become a police officer, you need to be a U.S. citizen 21 or older. You must pass physical written exams as well as drug tests, undergo a psychiatric evaluation and background check. A felony record may disqualify an applicant. And that was an interesting fact that I had found, that it said it may disqualify. All right, next slide. Oh, back up. One more. Oh. Oh, back it up again. The slide we're looking for starts with one of the last steps in the hiring process. Just one more. There we go. There we go. One of the last steps in the hiring process for police officers is the psychological exam. Can make or break a chance of someone having a law enforcement career. And that consists of written questionnaires, multiple choice psychological tests that measure abnormal behavior and altruistic pro-social behavior. And then once you pass those exams, next one. You have a face-to-face meeting with a psychologist. This face-to-face meeting often lasts anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. It discusses the applicant's background, work history, academic accomplishments, medical issues, and mental health conditions like depression. It also checks for, good impulse control, general intelligence, their judgment, dependability, any prior drug use, appropriate attitudes towards sexuality, what motivates them to become a police officer. Like Chief was saying earlier, not everybody wants to become a police officer to help people, but most of them do. At least they start out that way. Courage, honesty and integrity, personal bias or lack of bias, and ability to tolerate stress. The red flags that they look for in all these exams are drug use, hostility, questionable judgment, problems with authority, poor impulse control, and cultural bias. So those are all red flags that they're looking for at the very beginning before anybody can even take their first shift being a police officer. All right, next slide. So over time, mental health starts kicking in. Mental health concerns start kicking in police officers. PTSD and depression is 5% higher in law enforcement officers than general population. 80% of police officers suffer from depression or anxiety, and their suicide rate is 23 out of every 100,000 versus 14 out of every 100,000 for the general population. 25% of all police officers have an issue with drug or alcohol. So that's 1 in 4 at least develop an issue with drugs or alcohol. 20 to 30% of police officers have substance abuse disorders. For the general population, the rate is only 10. LEOs make up 40% of domestic violence cases versus 10% of those not involved in police work. I bring up the domestic violence cases because it starts showing the aggression, the violence. It starts out at home and often carries into their job. And let's compare that to the requirements of becoming a correctional officer. Next slide. So becoming a correctional officer definitely varies by state. Most require a high school diploma, GED, or equivalent. Some states, such as Mississippi, require completion of a 9th grade education due to high demand to fill vacancies as a result of low pay. So they actually just recently lowered their requirement to at least having a 9th grade education and at least 18 years of age. Some states do require age 21, but you can become a correctional officer at the age of 18. No felony convictions, must pass physical and written exams as well as drug tests, undergo the psychiatric evaluation and background check. Again, sometimes those are probably overlooked, especially with the states that are in high need of filling vacancies. You know, but one thing I want to kind of bring up is at the age of 18 to 21, your brain is still developing. So they're doing these psychological exams on a still developing brain. Let's talk now about the mental health in correctional officers. Next slide. High rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. 34% of COs experience symptoms of PTSD versus 14% of military personnel. We always hear about PTSD with somebody that has served in the military, but COs are 20% higher than somebody that has served in the military. 10 to 14 out of every 100,000 complete suicide. 10% of COs admit to suicide ideations and or attempts. 39% higher chance of suicide than average for other occupations. Higher levels of substance abuse, including on-the-job substance use. The next slide, I want to read this. And this came from an online survey provided to the Florida correctional officers. Results from 710 officers revealed that 33% of respondents knew about correctional officers who had committed unreported domestic violence. 30% reported that they had directly experienced domestic violence as children, and over 11% reported they had been physically violent with an intimate partner. Multivariate statistics showed that age, race, and childhood experiences with domestic violence were significantly related to correctional officers reporting being physically abusive to an intimate partner or family member. These and other findings highlight the need for increased agency prevention efforts and research on the phenomenon of correctional officer involved domestic violence. And I think, you know, if they do more work on that, they may start being able to decrease that the abuse and the violence that they're perpetuating inside of jails and prisons. All right, next slide is the mental health with incarcerated population. Anthony, your story is amazing. You know, the self-harming, you know, not only to feel alive, but to also try to get some help to get out of that confined space that you were in. I've been in a confined space as a firefighter, and you know, it's not fun. America has 25% of the world's incarcerated population, but America has only 5% of the total world population. There are 2.2 million people incarcerated in America. At least 50% of all people incarcerated have mental health concerns, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Up to 25% of people incarcerated have a serious mental illness versus 5% of the general population. That includes serious mental illness, includes conduct disorders, major affective disorders, schizophrenia. And suicide is the third leading cause of death in the incarcerated population, up to 40 out of 100,000. And continued substance abuse despite incarceration. Yes, drugs and alcohol still make it into the jails and prison. All right. So next slide. Talk a little bit about the commonalities between populations of law enforcement and those incarcerated. It's really not much different. higher levels of PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicide ideations, and substance abuse. Tumultuous environments impacted by high levels of stress, violence, and trauma. Lack of proper mental health treatment due to underreported mental health symptoms, lack of seeking mental health services, and or not providing appropriate services. So a lot of times police officers, correctional officers, and those incarcerated will not seek help because it looks like a sign of weakness. Well, so what's the result of all that? Next slide. A perpetuated vicious cycle of violence, death, hatred, fear, trauma, biases, constant state of fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, which is the inner part of your brain that is, the automatic part of your brain that does body functions that you don't even have to think about. And that is what initiates the fight, flight, freeze, or collapse reactions to stress, to trauma, to violence. A lot of times people might start out in that fight stage, but after time you get tired and it might lead into a flight reaction. And over time, with excessive stress, excessive trauma, you end up kind of going into a freeze or collapse state even, where you just can't do it anymore. Next slide. I know this is kind of small, but let's talk. So from a mental health perspective, and also working alongside police officers, as an EMT going into the prison systems, picking people up, a lot of times with mental health issues, I've seen a lot of different things. One thing that I don't quite understand is why there's only one psychological assessment evaluation for police officers and correctional officers at the beginning before they even start their job, and why they don't do routine assessments and evaluations. Somebody's brain starts to change over time. And if they were to do mandatory routine psychological assessments and evaluations, even like every 5 years, we might start seeing that somebody needs a break from their job, from the current job that they're doing. They might need to, maybe take a desk job for a little while and then go back out. But to just have it at an early age, to even get the job and never be reevaluated after that, I see a problem with that. I also have become a crisis intervention trainer, and I think that every single police officer, every single correctional officer should go through the crisis intervention training. It's a program and a training in law enforcement to help guide interactions between law enforcement and those living with a mental illness. And what they're finding with the crisis intervention training, the SIT training, is that it starts to develop a sense of empathy and understanding in the officers as far as what's going on the streets, what is going on with mental health issues. And I think COs need to take the SIT training as well. Mandatory mental health first aid training, just to kind of, like I said, have a better understanding of what's going on. Mandatory cultural competency and ethics trainings for all officers. I moved from New York to Mississippi, and the culture is completely different. I have seen things in the past year that I really didn't want to believe was true. And also a reopening of mental health beds throughout the nation. Instead of putting people in jail and prison that might have a mental health issue, put them back in the hospital where they can get the help that they need. And improved mental health services inside the criminal justice system, proper medications, improved rehabilitation, and a decrease, like Anthony, you were saying, decrease in human civil right violations on those incarcerated. That needs to stop. We know what goes on the streets, but a lot of times they hide what goes on behind the wall, and we don't see that as much. So what do you guys think as far as, what can help?
Is that a question to me?
Yes.
Us?
That's a question for you guys now. Now we're going to talk.
Oh, I think one of the things that can help is like, I think I would call it empathetic training, right? Where you talked about like the mental health, teaching them that, because as far as I see, the police, like we telling even correctional officers, police and correct, from my experience, they're like proactive instead of being reactive. And the problem with them being proactive is they might get it wrong, in which a lot of times they do get it wrong. They misinterpret things, or they make things become they put a stigma on you, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It comes true, not because it was right, but simply because they made it in the first place. Like, for example, somebody trying to run from a police on the street. Well, you get out yelling at him, you pull a gun out, he's feel threatened, he runs, right? Or in prison, they'll come to the cell door. You might be holding your tray because you didn't get some bread or some rice or what on your tray because I was on the menu. Well, to them, that's something small, but to the person in the cell, it's something significant, and it's something big, because he's not going to eat if they don't put that food on his tray, and he has to rely on them in order to eat. So the officer coming to the cell, no, when he go home, he can go home and get something to eat. He can stop at McDonald's. He can stop at Wendy's. He can go to Aldi's. He can go to Hy-Vee. He can go where, you know what I mean? So to him, that's not a big deal. Not understanding, he's not putting himself in that guy's shoe. And to this guy, it's not just a big deal, it's a very big deal. So he comes to the cell screaming, give up your effing tray. If you don't give up your tray, we're going to do this, etc., etc. So now you're putting the guy on the defense, and he's feeling like, well, you're trying to treat me lesser than what I am. And in prison, people are watching. So if you allow somebody to run over you in prison, then when the people are watching, they're going to look at it as like, well, he let him mistreat him. He let him treat him lesser than the man. So why can't I? So the thing is, in those kind of situations, they need to retrain him to teach him better social skills, a sense of empathy. Put yourself in that man's shoes and break things down like fraction to him, instead of just giving him some hasty course and then sending him out there saying, do the job.
Absolutely. You were just saying all that, and it made me think. I knew about that study that you had brought up. What the name of it?
The Stanford Prison Experience.
Yeah, I've known about that one, and it's one that I find very interesting. And they also do, for the juveniles, they do the Scared Straight program, where they send the juveniles into a jail or prison to spend a couple days to see what it's really like inside. And what if the roles were reversed just to get that empathy? What if correctional officers had to actually stay inside a jail or a prison for a little while to see what it's really like?
Oh yeah. In fact, you heard of Rick Ramish? I know Rick. You know Rick?
Not that I know of.
Well, look, Rick Ramish, I've talked to him, and he said he would be helpful. In any event, there was a guy, he was in solitary in Colorado. So solitary confinement, to me, is domestic terrorism. There's no doubt it's psychological torture, and it's a crime against humanity. There's no doubt about that. So there was a guy in Colorado who was in solitary, so he was tortured. So he got out, and he went to the director's crib First, he went to the pizza man. I'm not sure if he killed the pizza man or not, but I do know he went to the director's house and he killed the director. So now this made people stop and think. He killed the director. He was in solitary, etc., etc. So I don't know if they connected the dots, what or what not. But what they did do was they made Rick Ramesh like the director. So they sent Rick Ramesh and told him to try to fix the problem, see what's going on. So Rick Ramesh went in and he did 20 hours. Now remember, this is just 20 hours. And in those 20 hours, he realized how horrific solitary was, and they went and reformed it. So if they that should be part of their training. Go in solitary confinement for 3 days, so for 72 hours before you be able to become a correctional officer and work in solitary confinement. But not just that though. I think they need to. It's not just the training. There's a bigger picture here. I think as far as corrections, the bigger picture is dismantling solitary, because when you put people in an environment that's psychologically darker than the inside of a cow, it doesn't just affect one person, it affects the whole population. There's a true story from here where I'm at. Pontiac is the worst place you want to be in Illinois is in solitary confinement, because one is psychological torture, two, they prosecute you for symptoms of mental illness, and you can face up to 100 years like happened to me. Now, there's an officer that worked there for 20 years. On Christmas in 2019, he killed his wife, he killed his son, and he killed his neighbor, and he's sitting in the county jail right now fighting a triple homicide. So in addition, there's a lady that started off as a correctional officer. When she started, she was a 5-star sweetheart. I watched her. You know how they say change is a process, not an event? I watched her progress into an axis of evil. And I don't believe that it's her per se. I believe that the environment is so dark that it eats everyone up inside the environment. And anyone that gets in the environment, they get swallowed up by the psychological storm.
You know, the things that like Anthony has been through, the things that some police go through, some correctional officers go through, all these people go through, leaves marks on all of us. Listening to Anthony and listening to some others this week is going to be hard for some of you, but we need to do this. We need to listen. We need to talk. We need to understand. One of the things I learned as a young cop is every time I came across a situation, there were 3 truths. There was your truth, there was his truth, and there was the real truth, whatever that was in between. You know, it's very true that we see things differently. Everybody looks at things differently. Right now, I can tell you that I have cops out there who are circling the wagons because they feel attacked. We are not attacking anybody. That's just the point here. Everybody has to come together in a collaborative effort, that's my opinion, in order to impact anything here positively. The reason that Anthony spent 22 years in isolation, the reason that I spent 15 years going to calls alone and getting shot in the head by somebody paid by cops is because the system has failed everyone, and we lost control of the system many years ago. It's time for everybody, including cops, including public officials, people like Anthony who have been victimized by the system, psychological brains like Sarah Jane who could come in and let us know what's going on from a psychological standpoint. Because I can tell you, and I'm not going to speak for Anthony, but I have been diagnosed with PTSD as well. And believe me, I understand the PTSD, because every night when I try to go to bed, I get shot in the head. And that ended many, many years ago. But in order to have that happen, the intellect has to talk to the emotion and tell them that it's over. And I can tell you right now that when somebody looked at Anthony, when he finally left prison, somebody looked at Anthony and said, "Aren't you glad it's over?" And you know what? It's not, is it, Anthony?
Nope.
It's not over now. It's not going to be over tomorrow, because what has happened stays with us. But we can change the future. We can start changing where things go from here. But in order to do that, everybody has to come together and understand this is bigger than race. This is bigger than individuals. It's bigger than any of us. Don't feel attacked. Feel brought into a process. That's why I'm here. That's why Anthony is here. That's why Sarah Jane is here. None of us are getting paid to be here. We're all volunteers because we see a problem and we're trying to fix it. Is that not motivation, Sarah Jane, for doing something that we want to change that's messed up in our lives? I implore all of you out there, if you have any questions, if you have any feedback for us, please put it in there. Please let us know what your questions and your issues are, because this does not end tonight. It doesn't end tomorrow night. This is a process, and it's going to take time. Anthony, Sarah Jane, anything else you guys want to bring?
I have a question for Anthony. Knowing what you've gone through, having gone through it, do you have a despise for all cops, all COs?
No, I don't. I mean, I wouldn't say that I favor them. But no, because there's some good cops out there, and it would be a lie for me to say that it's not, right? There are some good correctional officers out there. It would be a lie to say it's not. Like when they would starve me and they would put me on the meal loaf, there was a few officers that risked their career to give me real food because they knew that I was being tortured. So it would be a lie for me to say that there's not, because there are. I mean, that would be unfair for me to say it. I mean, I think it's more, honestly, a systemic problem opposed to like individual officers. You know how people say that it's bad officers, are there bad apples? I don't. There's officers that got in trouble, believe it or not, that my heart went out to, and the reason why is because they might have did something because the policy allowed them to do it, but the policy was wrong and they were trained wrong, right? So at the end of the day, when it happens, instead of the department saying, "Look, we dropped the ball, we messed up, we sent this guy off," they back off and leave him out there by himself to fish on his own. So I don't think that it's individual officers. For the most part, I think it's more of a systemic problem that needs to be addressed.
I've worked over 43 years. I've worked with thousands of cops. In my experience, probably 90 to 95% of them are good people. They're just out there trying to do their job, grow a family, live their life like anybody else. There are some bad cops out there, no question. There are some that I didn't hire from other places. I refused to hire. There are some that I made a mistake and hired and got rid of as soon as I found out about the mistake. There are some that I worked to fire very hard because they were bad cops. But that's not many of them. Most of them are good, but most of them are afraid because they're afraid of the thin blue line. They're afraid of what happened to people like me because I arrested cops. And they look at what happened to me and they look at the career that I had to lead, the things I lost, the years I spent, and how it ended up in my career. They look at that and they say, no, we're not going to go that way. We're just going to go along. We see things, we hear things. It's like I don't see anything, I don't hear anything. And they go on and try to be innocent about it all. We need you guys, everybody out there, to stand up for what is wrong, stop it, and report it, because that's the only way that law enforcement or corrections, either one, is going to get better, is going to get improved if the good people who are there, we believe you're there, if the good people will stand up and do the right thing. And I could tell you that's really, really hard, especially for guys with families, with loved ones. They get threats like I got. We'll kill you. We'll gut your wife. I've seen those kinds of threats. I've seen those things that terrorize people. Whether you're in prison or you're on the street, we're all humans. And they feel those things. So right now, I can tell you they're circling the wagons out there. And I know exactly the messages that are going between them. And that's why it's so important that all of us come out like this, tell our stories, and as Sarah Jane has, try to bring it together and begin the process of where we go in the future. Begin to talk about solutions. What does it take to get better? And I think this is a good step forward. Anthony, Sarah Jane, anything?
This was a great panel, great conversation. Sorry.
She agrees.
Something she sure does. And I hope that I hope that we can continue to, have these conversations and it doesn't stop here.
Thank you, ma'am. Anthony, anything to close?
I appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate being a part of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is only a step in the process. We want this to continue. We invite you to come back tomorrow night and Friday night. Friday night, we come together and we'll discuss solutions for the future. This is a step we want to carry forward. We invite you to come with us, police officers, public officials. Let's sit down. Let's move forward with the process of bringing us all together. Thank you, everybody, for your time tonight, and we wish you good tidings.